comprise Lenape ancestral homeland, and this land was not ceded nor sold, as the folklore would have us believe, to the Dutch for beads and trinkets. This land was forcibly taken through the occupation of European settlers, resulting in displacement, forced migration, and genocide. In the present day, there are Lenape communities throughout North America, though much of the original Lenape territory remains under settler occupation and control. And as settlers who have benefited from the colonization of sovereign land, we acknowledge our responsibility to examine and question systems of oppression that continue through to the present day and educate ourselves about the original stewards of this land. We want to acknowledge the Haudenosaunee ironworkers from the Sixth Nation of the Iroquois, mostly from the Mohawk tribe, whose labor built the many iconic skyscrapers and skilled bridges in New York City. As recently as 2012, about 200 of the 2,000 structural iron workers in NYC were Mohawk. Every day we view the city skyline of Manhattan, we are reminded of their contribution. That's the land acknowledgement. And as I said, if you have questions, comments about the session as we are continuing in the session, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Just a reminder as well, everyone present here in the session, we will be recording the remaining session and posting the video on the social media. Folks who don't want to be seen can turn off their cameras now. With that, I would like to introduce you all to Annie Liu. Annie Liu is a research-based artist working at the intersection of art and science. Annie's work examines the relationships between science, technology, and the relationships on human subjectivity, culture, and identity. The themes that are prevalent in Annie's work include gender politics, biopolitics, labor, simulation, and sexuality. You might already be familiar with Annie's work because it has appeared at a number of venues, such as at the Venice Biennale, Ars Electronica, Queen's Museum Biennial, Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and many, many more. Annie's has been the winner of several fellowships and awards and is interested in approaching disciplines that can be integrated for art making. And as I heard from Annie just now, Annie is an associate professor of practice at University of Pennsylvania and has previously taught at Columbia as well as Harvard GSD. With all of that, I'm personally excited to welcome Annie as well, because Annie and I went to grad school together. Seems like this was a while ago, but I can tell you that Annie is an incredible storyteller. As a reminder to the attendees here, we will have 20 minutes for the talk and about 40 minutes for the Q&A. You may type these into chat and you can ask these questions later, verbally during the Q&A time as well. With that, Annie, super excited to have you to Cloud Salon today. Welcome, and the stage is all yours.
Great, thank you so much for that generous introduction, and I'm so excited to be here. Let me start by sharing my screen. And let me just arrange my Zoom windows. 1 second. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here with you today to share my work. I put together a new presentation, a new slide deck, so I'm testing it out. First time here. To start and to give you some background about me, I'm an artist that often makes work in the laboratory, using the tools of science and technology to investigate themes that artists have always investigated, themes of longing, nostalgia, sexuality, what it means to be human. At the core of my work, I deeply believe that while we shape our technologies co-shape us, and this feedback loop is a very important one to examine. I've studied and worked in architecture, wearable technology, and biological design. The nerdy part of me is interested in how things work and how knowledge is made, and the feeling part of me has its pulse on the body politics of emerging technologies. I thought I'd walk you through some of my education journey to let you know how I got here. And please feel free to ask me anything about my path. But I went to graduate school for architecture because I grew up in Chinatown in New York City, and I grew up kind of poor, and there was not really, I could not imagine what it meant to be an artist. It just seemed like all of my neighbors, everyone around me, it was like so foreign. And so I thought that architecture would be a good middle ground. And this is the school. It was really intense, but fruitful. You can probably tell from my desk here that I quickly learned that I was less interested in architecture and more interested in basically strapping computers to my face. The year I graduated from architecture school, Google Glass had just come out, as well as the Oculus Rift. And I got to try virtual reality for the first time in my life. As you can see, I wasn't always able to, at the library, you could rent Google Glass. I couldn't always rent it. So I made a lot of my own prototypes, often out of cardboard. And as a newly minted architect, I was really intrigued by the future of VR and what it would mean for how we would experience space or socialize or relate to the built environment. And I ended up creating my thesis around the topic of how wearable technologies will transform the ways that we socialize, be in space together. And I made strange helmets like this. I was teaching myself how to build circuits for the first time, teaching myself how to code, and they were scrappy. This is a project where I made a set of helmets that let you swap vision with someone else. So you would see through my eyes and I would see through yours. And when I was making this piece, I was reading a lot of theory, cybernetic theory, new media theory, and I wanted to create artworks that would allow me to experience these ideas and these theories through my body, through my senses, phenomenologically. So in this case, I was seeking to explore if we're living in the global village of the internet, where we're all extensions of each other in a network tethered landscape, what is it like to see through the eyes of someone else? How does traditional notions of subjectivity as we know it shift or break? And this is a picture of my mentor, Christoph Woditsko, and we were trying on the vision swap helmets together for the first time. So I was really interested in, what if we can live and breathe and experience the theories of academia that we generally only read. After I defended my thesis, I was lucky enough to invited back to teach a studio based on these ideas. And I got to run a small research group called Sensory Mediation at the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities. And we were researching how wearable tech could create more sustainable behaviors in buildings. And while I was teaching and doing that research, I serendipitously met Hiromi Ozaki, also known as Sputniko, who was spearheading a new group at the lab called Design Fiction. And I ended up joining that group. I think the tagline is that this group occupies a space somewhere between art, design, science fiction, and science fact. And at MIT, I was lucky enough to rub shoulders with scientists working in all kinds of cutting edge fields, synthetic neurobiology, virtual reality, sculpted evolution, everything from artificial intelligence to artificial life. And in my group, we're always asking, there's brilliant scientists working in their labs to make the world a better place. And part of the group was to ask, what is better? What is better for you, for me, for a Black woman, a gay man, a retired veteran, a kindergartner in a wheelchair? And I think this is an image you're all very familiar with, but it was through that group that I became very influenced by the ideas of speculative design, design fiction, and critical design. I believe it's the role of artists and designers to raise critical questions, and that art is how we can see and feel the future. So in my journey, we've kind of gotten to here, and I've made quite a few projects between then and now, and I'm going to flip through some of the slides really quickly because I want to get to some more recent work that I've been making. So I'm just going to flip through these and we can refer back to any of these projects. Great. I wanted to come back here and skip to here because I wanted to speak to you as a mother and how becoming a mother has transformed my practice. I was lucky enough to give birth twice. And during the pandemic, it really felt like this. Children don't really fit tidily on timelines, and my rhythms of life adapted to the rhythms of care. When I first got pregnant, I wanted a science-based pregnancy, and I kind of laugh at myself to say that now, but I looked for data-driven answers to simple questions like, can I drink coffee in the morning? What about wine at night? Can I take a really, really hot bath? Like things that I thought that I could find the answers through data because, being a research-based artist, I sat down with all of the textbooks and looked for these answers. But as I did my research, I found that there were a few hurdles. Despite the fact that 8.6 out of every 10 persons with uteruses globally will give birth at least once, Research around women's reproductive bodies is steeped in histories of sexism and racism, resulting in biased and incomplete knowledge. There's not enough time to deep dive here, but epistemologically, once we started medicalizing birth, everything from the process, language, and naming of the reproductive system became problematically filtered through a male gaze. And this is not to say that I don't love data and science and knowledge. I think we actually need more research in this domain. For instance, in PubMed, there are twice as many papers about erectile dysfunction than there are about breast milk. There's an amazing researcher, Katie Hind, who gives a talk about this, but she points out that we know more about coffee, wine, and tomatoes than we do about breast milk. So in this sea of unknown, in order to make sense of my own pregnancy, I did what felt natural to me. I made art about it. As hormonal waves overtook my body, as I swelled and started to ache, I came across feminist writer Shulamith Firestone, who noted, as long as women carry the burden of reproductive labor, there cannot be equality between the sexes. And this quote really struck me. And so I started to fantasize, like many did before me, about artificial wombs. And most conventional depictions are mechanical. And I started to wonder, what if the future of artificial wombs aren't welded, but grown? I started to learn about interspecific pregnancy, where one species can carry the pregnancy for another species. We actually did this with cats to try to foster the populations of endangered pandas. And so I started to research pigs as a potential surrogate. After all, we've already engineered pigs to produce human organs. Very recently, the very first heart transplant from a pig occurred in a human. But the deeper I dove into the research, the more I started to feel uneasy. Was this not just another form of colonization? Surrogacy is not simple. It can allow same-sex couples to have a child, empower women to help those in need, and exploit the health of those in poverty all at once. Perhaps we don't need a techno-utopian answer to gender equality. We need policy changes that can make room economically and culturally for reproductive health. Paid family leave is especially important in the postpartum period. For medical reasons, I recorded how often my daughter was fed and changed in the first month after she was born. And you can see here from top to bottom, the 24 hours of a day, and from left to right, the days of a month. And as you can see, we didn't do a lot of sleeping. And I love this cartoonist Leanna Fink, and I think it's captured best in this comment, my amazing vacation from emails. The pandemic revealed that mothering is essential work, and without childcare, families were pushed to crisis. As an artist, I've been recording and trying to make sense of my own experiences through the material culture of my motherhood, with breast milk and diapers and breast pumps and toys. I became really interested in toys. After all, I think we're all primed from childhood for the systems society wants us to abide by, and I've been studying toys as a behavioral simulator. And research shows it's not just child's play, it can have real impact on identity formation. So these are some vintage ads. This one's from 1925, a Sears ad for a toy and broom mop set, and it literally proclaims, mothers, here's a real practical toys for little girls. Every little girl likes to play house, to sweep, and do mother's work for her. And then this one, girls' toys typically are designed to prepare young girls for a life of homemaking and domestic tasks, and are portrayed as innately enjoyable for women. Ads like these are still common, although less prevalent. And then on the other hand, while girls' toys focus on domesticity, boys' toys generally emphasize preparation for working in the industrial economy. So in this example from 1925, a Sears ad for an erector set, it says that every boy likes to tinker around and try to build things. With an erector set, he can satisfy this inclination and gain mental development without apparent effort. He will learn the fundamentals of engineering. And so I started by analyzing existing toys, which still tend to be incredibly gendered. These are images of toys that have been scraped from Target, Walmart, and Amazon, and I pixel sorted them. So just to look at the palette, they're pixel sorted within the silhouette of the toy. And this is the same exercise with toys tagged with boys. And that's the interesting thing, the data set already was tagged by gender. And then I worked with a student of mine, Ryan Thorpe, and we fed this information into a machine learning algorithm. We scraped all of the titles of the toys and also the descriptions. And then based on what it learned, we asked the machine learning algorithm to invent new toys. We were trying to get the zeitgeist of what makes a toy male or female. And so these were some of the toys that it generated. The results are strange and weird and tell a story about how we teach gender through objects. I think one of my favorites was this one. It captured like the sassiness of the marketing language. Yo-yo lip gloss DIY squishy doll me up. In case you didn't get the memo, tweens are obsessed with hair clips again. And so these are a little bit further along in the training. The top row are all toys generated from the girls' data set, and then the bottom row are all toys that it generated based on what it learned from the boys' data set. And as you can imagine, the girl set focuses on domesticity, cosmetics, unicorns, fluffy things, things of care. I think this one is kind of interesting. Oops. It says, I can change anything because girl power, and then it just adds kitchen to it because it learned that, you know, girls' toys are full of domesticity. And then with the boys' data set, lots of weapons, things, lots of engineering, tinkering sets, things that are much more focused on, I think, violence. And I find this interesting because we are biocultural organisms. We're shaped not just by biology, but also by the environmental and material context that we live in. So how might we unlearn gendered values starting in childhood? And while I've often referred to my pregnancy and my motherhood on feminine terms, I want to acknowledge that there are many people with uteruses who also give birth as men or non-binary. And how might design help them break barriers too? I've been speaking with transgendered persons for the last 2 years to learn more about what types of garments are gender affirming to different people. And I've been designing a series of pregnancy menswear to normalize and remake stigmatized assumptions between gender, sex, and fertility. And so these suits are made out of silk and out of boning, and they're meant to look like a drawing because I consider them still works in progresses, and I'm planning on making a series. And I also wanted to note that we need to fully support our friends who don't choose parenthood as well, starting with protecting abortion rights. This is a piece called Mind-Controlled Sperm, which I made in 2016 to 17 during the election of Donald Trump. And if you remember, at some point, he said this really notoriously, grab them by the pussy. And I was particularly devastated when he won the election, not just for all of the executive orders that he would sign, but also of him as a symbolic figure, a person that young boys and girls would look up to, making such horrendous sexist comments and still getting elected anyway. And so I made this piece as a response. I created a device where I could control sperm with my mind, and I wanted to challenge the status quo of a woman being passive, being controlled. And I know that it sounds absurd, but historically and even currently, and especially currently with all of the politics going around right now, we often see it's mostly men that pass laws that deeply affect women's bodies. And of course, this is not a new idea. And I think that a lot of artists have been making work around this. And so it works like this. I used a brain-computer interface capturing electric signals generated by my thoughts. And the signals were translated into a system that I engineered to control the movement of sperm. And the movement of sperm, as it turns out, can be influenced by electric fields. At 12 volts per centimeter, they'll swim left or right towards the positive electrode. And so with a microcontroller, I can translate the signals from the brain EEG to switch an electric field back and forth. And this was some of the first tests that I did. And you can kind of see that not all of the sperm are swimming in one way. And I think this is one of the things that I find so interesting in working with biological entities, that it's not quite like programming an LED, that biology is disobedient. And I like that. So why do this? What symbolic implications are there to a woman controlling sperm with her thoughts? What are some counter narratives to a history of female reproduction being controlled predominantly by men? Even during the research, I found all kinds of things in the history of medicine and science, ways in which quote unquote facts at the time were incredibly gendered. Literally, there would be texts that would say the heroic journey of the sperm towards the passive egg, if unfertilized, would slough off like garbage. And I deeply believe that, you know, culture and science, we're all in an interwoven path together, and that artists can really contribute to this conversation and change public sentiment. So I created this project to raise questions about the biopolitics of reproduction, bodies, gender, and control. And I think representations are important, that we are the stories we tell ourselves. Just gonna check on time. Okay. I think this is the end. I wanted to, you know, emphasize and acknowledge that a lot of this work is not done in a silo, and I wanted to recognize the amazing students and interns that I've had the pleasure of working with over the pandemic across 3 continents and 5 time zones. So that was quick, but I'm hoping we'll have a robust conversation and talk more about any of the projects that I showed.
Thank you so much, Annie. A round of applause. These in the ways that we can do it over Zoom.
Thank you.
Super incredible work. I'm sure people will have lots of questions. So people who do have questions, you know, please feel free to unmute yourself and, you know, ask your questions.
I have,
This is probably from the broadcasting room, so it's going to take a minute.
No worries.
okay, I think this is better. So I have a question. A lot of themes in your work are very global, such as gender politics, labor. And I was wondering if it is important for you, is it going well? To keep your work universal and relatable.
Thanks for that question. I will say that most of the work comes from a personal place to start. And I think the personal is political, you know what I mean? Like, I live in this body with a uterus. I'm Chinese American. I feel like we are so entangled in the kind of socio-political, economic, geographical, environmental weave of the world that it's hard not to make something that hopefully does resonate to so many things. It's like a domino effect. So I will say that usually it starts from a very personal place. I didn't know, if you asked me 10 years ago that I would be making so much work about lactation, for instance, I wouldn't have predicted it, but I just found that given all the things that are happening to my body currently, it's just something that's, I don't know, like, I guess as artists, we all do this, right? We make work about our own lived truth. And then as I learned more about it, I couldn't help but do the research and learn about all of the other ways that, for instance, lactation is also related to plastic pollution because it enters my body and then into my baby's body, and like we're all molecularly linked in this way. So I would say that it comes from the personal, and then I think it kind of spreads from there, and hopefully it resonates to more bodies than mine. What emotions do you hope to evoke in your audience? That's interesting. So I paused because some of the work that I showed is really new, like literally working on it in my studio this morning, new. And so for me, it's almost like I need to make it to understand what's happening. It's my own way of kind of like how some writers tell me that writing helps them make sense of reality. I think that's kind of what I'm doing in terms of the work. There are different pieces that I will say, like for the mind-controlled sperm piece, I think it was important for me to show people how absurd it is to control someone else's body, someone's reproductive body in this way. I think that there was a certain shock to it, like, is this real? Can this really happen? I think that some people found it vile. Many men told me that it was violating to them, which was really interesting because it wasn't their sperm, it wasn't in their body. And yet so many real things do happen, like forced sterilization and lack of access to reproductive care and things like this. So I think that, I guess it's not an easy answer. There's a whole range of emotions that I'm hoping to evoke depending on the different pieces. Yeah. Let's see. I'm just going through the chat list, and also feel free to unmute if you want to ask any of the questions.
I think Oscar has a question. Oscar asks, can you speak more to creating speculative queer futures, please?
Excellent question, and something that I think about. I think I'm trying to assemble my thoughts. I think it's complicated for me right now sometimes, working as an artist who loves science, who also collaborates with scientists, because I really believe in evidence-based truths. And I feel like there are a lot of evidence-based truths that are under attack, like, should we be vaccinated? Should we wear masks? There's all kinds of things that are not just scientific anymore, but intimately connected with politics. And one of the things that I talk a lot about with my students, and something that I'm trying to sort out in my own practice, is how do we get at so-called truths? And then also, how do we kind of practice science with empathy and the ability to say that we were wrong? So when you look at the history of knowledge making, right, there are many times, where like, the universe revolves around Earth. And then someone comes around and makes celestial observations and proves that it's not true. Like, and then of course there's like a whole scandal and the church is involved. I'm kind of curious, how do you go through this whole process of experimentation, observation, making knowledge, and then another generation coming along and making more knowledge and acknowledging that you're wrong? And I'll get back to the querying, I promise. I think part of it is not thinking so black and white, I guess, like not thinking in binaries. And I think it's kind of tough, because I think that for me as a student, I think very early on in science, I think one of the first things I learned is classification. Like, how do you organize all of reality into compartmentalized pockets, and how do we name them? And I think that as an artist, I think I got the opposite training, that everything is kind of on a spectrum, and we can acknowledge and embrace complexity and ambiguity and things that contradict each other. So I think that this is where I'm trying to go back to, I think this is where speculative queer futures is so important, because I think it allows that complexity to enter the conversation while not dismissing science, if that makes sense. So hopefully that's a very untidy answer, but hopefully you kind of understand what I'm saying. And I see a hand, Jenny.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. That was really cool. I have a general question, I guess, about your process as a creative technologist or creative scientist. So I'm wondering how you think about balancing like the tool or the technology that you use versus the topic area. Because I think often when students are taught some new skill, like for example, in your work, like pixel sorting or machine learning tools or 3D printing, it's kind of like being given a hammer and everything kind of looks like a nail. So I think in some extreme cases, I sometimes feel that a lot of creative tech projects kind of come across as kitschy or like simplified to just like input, do something cool with it, and it becomes an output. So as an artist, how do you like balance keeping that conceptual theme and vision like mature and keeping it from just being kitschy? Because I see a lot of AI work, especially, that is just kind of run through a process, and they're kind of like, cool, I thought about this, but the rigor wasn't really there.
Mm-hmm. Such a good question. I am really guilty of drinking the Kool-Aid, quote unquote, really hard. And I think I just kind of have to do it in private. Like the first time, like, I don't know, many years ago when I first started to see machine learning art, I was like, I just have to get all the bad art out of the system. You know what I mean? Because it's cool. And I feel like the first time I tried VR, for instance, I feel like you kind of have to, and I'm just a really cheesy person, I think you just kind of have to allow yourself to be awed by the newness of it, and then be so immersed and see so much of it that you get to calm down and finally think thoughts. You know what I mean? I feel like my father explained to me the first time he ever saw a television, just like how shocking it was, because he was a rice farmer and there was so little technology that was that he had access to. But you know, just like anyone else, given enough of it, then he can actually kind of focus on the content of it. And I think that that's something, I suppose it's kind of like the practice, right, of being an artist. I think that first you kind of have to dive in and then pull out. Another cheesy reference, but when I first read The Medium is the Massage, Marshall McLuhan, it was so influential for me. After I read that book, I couldn't stop looking at all of the tools in a very critical way. And I think it's just also an exercise. I can't unsee it in a way. And so probably you all as practitioners are constantly learning so many new tools. Like I think that in my lifetime, I've learned like 40 different 3D modeling software, starting with Form Z, if anyone remembers Form Z, and CATIA and things like that. And I find it really interesting because there was a time in architecture school where I feel like I could almost tell what type of, like, was this made in Revit? Was it made in Rhino? Was it made in Maya? You can almost tell based on the forms, because certain tools are so prone to developing certain things. So yeah, I don't know, no good answer to that, but I think that it's important to really get it out of the system. So for instance, when I first learned how to laser cut it, like everyone I knew got a laser cut something, laser cut Christmas present, laser cut birthday present, laser cut etch cards, everything. And I think that, you know, after a while, after becoming intimate with the technology, maybe finally the relationship can begin. Yeah. I will go back into the questions.
So the stack, because there's so many questions coming in, Shan has a question. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I was wondering if you could repeat the feminist texts and theories that have influenced your work.
Oh, so many. Maybe this is something that I can share in a comment or something on the YouTube channel or email you.
Sure.
Because I can try to pull up a list,
yeah,
and share it.
So next is Jessica. It says, how is ancestry considered in your work, both going back through generations and forward? Curious about how your children will interact with your research, considering their becoming was so formative to it.
That's a really good question. Ancestry. It's so funny because I think about ancestry, but not in the way this question was so thoughtfully phrased. I was thinking a lot about ancestry in terms of genetic engineering and what it means to knock out genes that people find unsavory. You know, like I think that the idea of a designer baby has been around for a while, but I think we're getting very close to it. And so I think about that critically in terms of what does it mean to perfect genetics, if that exists. But in terms of, you know, I must admit that in order to make my work, sometimes I can't think too much about how my children will react to it. And it's not just specific to my children. I think that when I get into a space of creation, I can't think about what any critic might say. And maybe you're the same way, that the making space is almost like a sacred space where I convene with myself and other entities, but I don't think a lot about how it will be received. And then there's definitely a critical editing part of me that comes into the room and then does that work a different day. But I would be curious. I will say that it doesn't quite answer your question, but I really love making art with my daughter. It's really interesting to watch her develop cognitively and to think about how humans are so gravitated towards acts of creativity and how meaningful it is. So yes, not exactly the answer to your question, but hopefully that gives you something to chew on.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Fantastic, Annie. I see the Biodesign Challenge class has now started to step up their game. BDC class, I see you. Rachel, listening to your answer about immersing yourself in tech before working on a project in order to keep your art mature and wondering, how long do you spend developing a single project? How much do you work? How many do you work on at a time?
That's a good question. I think different practitioners will tell you different answers. I typically work on 2 to 3 at a time. Some of them take a really long time, like the Surrogacy project I've been working on since 2019, since I was pregnant with my first child, and then a whole pandemic happened in between. And it's still something that I'm working on because I think it's a complicated topic that I don't want it to be a one-liner, and I want to give it the kind of care. And I guess this is me thinking out loud because I still haven't figured out how to lay it all out there visually to tell the story, and maybe it requires something like a video or something like that. But I would say that I'm working on 2 to 3 projects at a time, and I allow the projects however long it takes to create. But on the other end, I'm also always kind of tinkering around if I have time. So there are skills and things that I'm playing with that might not show up in a current project. So for instance, if you're interested in making machine learning based work, maybe you're making something totally different. Maybe you're growing mycelium for the next 2 years, but on the side, you're tinkering around with AI and machine learning, and then somehow later on it converges. I think that when I was a student, I was so like, it's the whole publish and perish type of environment. It was like sprinting all the time, and it was really difficult, and I was so sleep deprived. And to tell you the truth, I'm still sleep deprived, but now I try to give myself the luxury of really thinking things through and making it at the scale that it requires. There are always deadlines, I guess, like exhibitions and things like that. But yeah, I think it's important to really give the work the room to breathe and live. So it's different for different people and different projects.
Thank you. So Caleb's question, could you talk a little bit about how your process deals with the relationship between developing a very real and functional intervention while working in a speculative space where you are also developing the narrative surrounding these interventions? How do you reconcile the division that sometimes emerges between the two? Do you prioritize one over the other in separate stages of your project?
Very good question. I will say that I think the speculative space is very real. Like the slide where I said, I think we are the stories we tell ourselves, is really, I take that to heart, because especially now I'm always reading bedtime stories, and a lot of bedtime stories have a lot of societal values and ethics kind of imbued in them. And think about all of the representations, for instance, that I consumed. I'm thinking of all of the Disney movies that I watched where a princess was saved, and how that made me form my own thoughts about what love is and what it means to be a woman, for instance. And so there are so many, or another example, Handmaid's Tale, The Matrix, I don't know, or Black Mirror. I feel like there's so many cultural, and maybe we call them speculative, projects that really embed itself into the cultural psyche and become really real. I think you see that a lot too in tech, where lots of Star Trek and lots of, I think the infamous one is Minority Report, gesture interfaces actually make them their way into the fabric of our technological lives now, because someone watched that at some point and then became an engineer and then spearheaded that project. So I feel like it's really, it's not to say that speculative is so far from the real. I think that, again, on a continuum. But I think that I get what this question is getting at too, because I think that as a designer, there are certain practicalities too. You know, when you work in industry, you have a client and there are parameters. And then maybe when you're working more speculatively for your art leaning practice, the client is more ambiguous. And I think that, I don't know, weaving back and forth between these is so great. I think that limitations actually really spark creativity in many ways. And so I would say that lean into both and really hold to your heart that the speculative things that you create have really real implications.
Thanks so much, Annie. So Simone has the next question, and this is related to what Jenny was mentioning earlier. Why did you choose toys as a medium to dig deep in with machine learning, considering there are so many other things that girls and boys use differently, for example, accessories?
It's a good question. I started with toys because it was like, again, this may be just going back to the personal. It was the one thing that irked me quite a bit. And I feel really lucky because after my daughter was born, in my family, there were a lot of other people who had children. So we inherited a lot of things. I didn't have to buy a lot of things, which is so great. But everything we inherited was pink. And there were just so many baby strollers and baby, like all kinds of, it was all very gendered, the things that I got. And I started to I think as a designer, as a visual person, I was like, oh my gosh, like from the minute this person is born, they're being surrounded by a material ecology that is telling them this is what it means to be based on the body that you were born in. And so I think toys just happen to be a particular pain point for me. But I agree with you that there's so many other things to analyze, and I would love to open up the project to more things.
Amazing. So as you talk about the visual, your visual affinities, Annie, I have a question. And this is more from, from the role of a faculty and how you pursue the research. In your presentations, not only just now, even the previous ones, I've seen so many historical precedents, especially these cutouts from magazines, human physiology, or the incident from Napoleon, that you once quoted in your talk regarding smells, for example. Even today, the erector set, for example, that you quoted, it had. How do you go about doing that kind of research and bring out the narrative finally to in the talks or whosoever you're talking to in the audience?
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess for me, I like going forward and backwards a lot, because for some of the projects, especially when I was at the Media Lab, for instance, it's always the most cutting edge research. It's like the research that hasn't even been published yet. Like, what can CRISPR do now? What is a gene drive? What is sculpted evolution? And it was so exciting, but I think part of being interdisciplinary is also talking to anthropologists and sociologists and historians, and taking that very new thing that we could have never imagined and then zooming out and putting it back into the context of everything else, and trying to find patterns in history. And also, I think because some of the barriers to change is the cultural history, right? Like, I remember when I wore Google Glass around, everyone took pictures of me and was like, ew, that's terrible. Like, why are you doing this? Only super nerdy, certain kind, like there were whole Tumblr blogs, I think, of people wearing Google Glass in very uncool ways. And I kept thinking about why this particular item failed. And I think it's because we weren't culturally ready yet to adapt it. And I think that, for instance, Snap has introduced their own, I don't know if I can call it an augmented reality glasses, but they have introduced other kinds of wearable tech glasses. And I think that it's fashioned into very conventional looking sunglasses, kind of hipster sunglasses. So I think it's kind of important sometimes when you are trying to make change, or when you're trying to tell a story, when you're trying to grab onto the emotional threads that make something that seems very new and sci-fi part of like the cultural psyche is to kind of go forward and back. And sometimes, honestly, when I do my research, the history looks like sci-fi to me. Like, can't believe this actually happened and it's so awful. And I think it's important to look at that because it gives us some clues as to why we still have certain biases. Like, there are certain things that, for instance, I uncovered about the history of gynecology that were really disturbing to me and kind of helped me understand why certain obstetric practices are the way they are today, and where I might push back and where I might not push back in my own care, for instance. And I think it's complicated. You know, we're also diverse. So yeah.
Just to follow up on that question, I mean, are there any sources that you specifically go to find these, like imagery that helps you convey this context as well for a lot of your projects?
It's a good question, but I must say that it's really random. One of the things that I try to do is keep a good archive for myself. So I try to, if I see something interesting in a book or a magazine or a website, I try to take a screenshot or a picture of it, and then I try to file it in my own database. Right now I'm using Airtable, which I end up liking, but it's tagged with many things. Like, it's tagged with the specific, like, neuroscience, but then it's also tagged with like whatever feeling, like existential anxiety. So then when I make the work, I can go back by tag and look for the thing. Yeah.
Super cool. I mean, I hope for the students and for us all, that practice seems really good for everyone. So Laurie and Wes have a question, and it says, you mentioned that the excitement and surprise of imposing technological systems on other biological organisms that are not necessarily human, and the messiness that results. What are some of the most interesting and exciting surprises you have encountered in this type of work?
I love working with biological organisms and living things because it's a collaboration. And I think it speaks to the fact that we're actually always in collaboration, that it's just kind of invisible. We, of course, all have microbiomes. We have to feed the biomes in order for them to help us digest and to stay well. And I think that when we make art about it, I haven't always done this well in the past, and it's something that I'm continuing to evolve in, but it's like an existential philosophical thing, right? Like, how do I make work with another species that's not exploitative, but instead is actually integrated and collaborative and reveals things, not just to me, but maybe to it also. And how do you develop both the visual language and the systems and also the verbal language around it? Sorry, I think I got off track. I'm reading the question again. Yeah, these are just some of the exciting things, like in terms of things that I find interesting and exciting, like just figuring out what that means, what it means to not be exploitative when I collaborate with another species is something that I ask myself a lot. There are things that I'm doing in my current life that I think echo back into it. Like, I started gardening during the pandemic, and maybe even saying started gardening is a bad way of saying it. Like, I'm learning how to grow lots of other species that we generally consider food. But it like so deeply tied me into the microbiome of the soil and also the local raccoon and also all of the things. And then the other thing is also back to, I think, becoming a parent, that, you know, a child is just adds so much chaos into the system. And I've been learning how to work with it and live with it. I don't know. I think it's such an interesting and wonderful relationship. And I guess, to tell you the truth, as someone who's kind of a control freak, like it like helped me reconsider, I don't know, all of the ways that I related to the world. Yeah. Oh yay, BDC linked some articles that we wrote. Thank you.
Perfect. I'm happy to see BDC here as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Annie. I think we asked you a lot of questions, and now it's time for a glass of water for you to take a break from these questions. And thank you for sharing your perspective, your content, and your time so generously today. I have personally shown a lot of your work in the class, and while we thank you for this virtual appearance in Cloud Salon, we'll hope that you'll be visiting physically soon as well.
Yes, I would love that as well. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all of these really thought-provoking questions. I will continue to think about them, and I can't wait to see all of your work develop and spark joy and thoughts in me as well. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. And for all the others in attendance today, we'll hope you have ample time to absorb the questions and the answers. Thank you to the Cloud Salon team, especially the students from the Cloud Salon class, Neil, Ayo, Anna, Hannah, Joshua, Trish, and Zane. Thank you for making the Cloud Salon possible. And of course, Richard, who is behind the scenes working out the parts of everything. Annie, it was great to have you, and we'll see you soon.
Amazing. Thank you. And to Richard's class, I'll see you soon in 5 minutes.
Thank you. See you in a second. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.